Board Talk Podcast Season 2, Episode 2. We're going to talk about podcast startup. Let's do it.
It's excellent.
So excellent, boy.
It's excellent. Kyren, engage. First, they ain't gon' grind like this. They ain't gon' push like this.
There you go.
They ain't gon' fight like this. They ain't gon' move like this. They ain't gon' build like this. They ain't gon' think like this.
Yes, sir.
They ain't gon' fight like this. They ain't gon' push like this. They ain't gon' shine like this. They ain't gon' drip like this. They ain't gon' push like this. They ain't gon' move like this. They ain't gon' fight 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 like this.
Yes, sir.
No lie, see no competition. From their eyes I see they feel the vision. No weapon, crush the opposition.
Diamonds dancing, moving like they rhythm. What's going on, everybody? My name is Kyren Monteiro, and I am your host of the Board Talk Podcast presented by Frequency Canvas, and we want to give all of our listeners and supporters a round of applause. Real quick to get the formal stuff out of the way. Hope all is well with y'all. Make sure that y'all check the Board Talk Podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, all of that good stuff. High definition videos available on the Frequency Canvas YouTube channel. This podcast exists to be centered around things that are related to audio production in the music industry. And I have been getting a lot of questions in person, via email, social media, and stuff like that, because I have a couple of podcasts myself. I had this Board Talk Podcast, which is presented by Frequency Canvas. Then I have my own show called the Kyren Monteiro Show, which is also available on all platforms and YouTube as well. And that's presented by Frequency Canvas. And, of course, my audio production company, Frequency Canvas, we are a part of producing several other podcasts outside of our own. So podcast production is something that we specialize in. And so today on season 2, episode 2 of the Board Talk Podcast, we want to talk about podcast startup, aka starting up a podcast. Some things to consider is that if you want to be a successful podcaster, you have to play the long game. Starting up a podcast, I mean, some people take off within 6 months to a year, but a lot of people who have built up successful podcasts that have turned into their own businesses and lucrative and became a stream of revenue for them and their brand, or just making a brand out of that podcast and a business out of that. It takes time. It takes time to build up trust with the listener. It takes time to gain followers and subscribers and supporters. It takes time. So if you're thinking about becoming a podcaster and getting into podcast creation to blow up overnight, you may want to consider doing something else. Okay? Everybody's not going to be a Joe Rogan overnight, right? You're not going to be a Joe Budden podcast overnight. You're not going to be $1 million worth of game podcast overnight. You're not going to be a full send podcast overnight. It's not going to happen like that. So if you are wanting to become a podcaster, if you're wanting to get into podcast creation, you are playing the long game. Please know that. Yeah. So once again, this episode is going to be called Podcast Startup. Hand clap for all the podcasters out there. First thing, we're going to cover 4 different areas. We're going to cover equipment and gear. We're going to cover recording. We're going to cover editing and post-production. And then we're going to cover the podcast host, a.k.a. podcast distribution. All right? So let's go ahead and let's dive into this first area of starting up a podcast, and that is the equipment and the gear, right? There are one of the most important things about doing a podcast. I know that video podcasts have taken over both of our shows, the Kyren Monteiro Show and this podcast, the Board Talk Podcast. We have high definition videos available. So while we're doing these podcasts, at the moment, we have one camera capturing high definition footage that we distribute on YouTube, as well as the audio across all of the major platforms for podcasting, right? Here's the thing. The microphone that you choose is so important because podcasts can't exist without a camera. Let me say that again. Podcasts do exist without cameras. So all of this other stuff, like, I've heard some people give, crazy advice, like as long as, your podcast can look great and you kind of downplay the audio production in podcast production is the most important thing. If you want to be a great podcast, you got to sound great. Great podcast sound great, period. Hand clap for audio, all right? You got to take that serious. So what I'm going to recommend for anybody that is wanting to start up a podcast, whatever level you're at, you want to get a dynamic microphone, right? In recording studios for recording artists, or you see people in the studio doing voiceovers for movies and commercials. Most of the time, you're going to see what's called a condenser microphone, right? The detail that those microphones give and the pickup, meaning like how much that microphone captures during the recording process, is amazing. For a recording studio, for a podcast recording, it is terrible. You don't want to get a large condenser mic. What you want to get is a dynamic microphone, like what you hear my vocals coming through now. This is the Shure MV7 microphone, which is the recreation of the Shure SM7B, which you see everybody and their mama using on radio shows and podcasts, even in recording studios. That's what Michael Jackson used Thriller to record his vocals with. So this is the recreation of that. And the reason that you want a dynamic microphone like this is that it's meant to pick up things within about an inch within the radius of the microphone capsule. So it's meant for you to be right up on it. And the reason that is if you're in an area where you're not in a room that is treated, right? There's something called reflections, and reflections are caused from hard surfaces in a room. And so that's when you can hear what it sounds like, echo or reverb in a room. Well, recording, that's not what you want. That's terrible. So you want to get a dynamic microphone, because a dynamic microphone is going to be able to capture like right what's in front of it, and it's not going to pick up the rest of the room the same way that a large condenser microphone will work. So no disrespect to anybody who may be advising podcast consultations and things like that, but if they're telling you to get anything but a dynamic microphone, don't listen to them. Even if you are in a treated environment, you want to make sure that you get a dynamic microphone. It's just gonna work out. You're also going to want to have a pair of quality headphones. I know you see some people, they don't wear headphones. Anytime I record podcasts for clients or have guests on the show, I always encourage people, put the headphones on, because if we do things like play sound bites or play music or have a call-in interview or something like that, you have to be able to have the headphones on to hear that. And it is also very good to know what you sound like coming through the microphone and what the audience is going to be hearing. If you're going to be talking, you need to know your voice. As a podcaster, you need to know your voice. It's just like I advise recording artists on when they're recording their music in the studio. You need to hear yourself through the headphones while you're recording your record, so that you know the strengths and weaknesses of your voice. Same thing with a podcaster. A podcaster, you are, in a way, you're an artist. Like, you're a recording artist in content form. So you need to have headphones. In my opinion, as a professional audio engineer and podcast production specialist, I always advise headphones. So dynamic microphones are going to be the best choice. There's all kinds out there. You can get USB versions that plug directly into a computer. or that plug into, different microphone preamps and mixing boards. But dynamic microphones are going to be your best choice. There's all different kind of price ranges. You want to get a pair of quality headphones. You don't have to spend the most money on them. Just something comfortable, something that feels good, something that, looks good if you're going to be on camera. Also, you need to figure out the amount when it comes to the gear. And part of that, you need to figure out how many microphones you're going to need. We have, on our podcast setup, we have 4 microphones. So we have 4 of everything, 4 microphones, 4 headphones, 4 different mic stands of each kind, like 4 cables, 4 headphone extension cables. We have to have 4 of everything so that we can, use our setup at max capacity when needed. Also, I would advise having a computer so that you can record your software, so that you can record your podcast. If you're going to have a USB microphone, it's going to need to go into a computer so that it can work. You can buy devices like the Rodecaster Pro. Zoom makes different things where you don't have to have a computer to get the recording done, right? That you can put an SD card in devices like that and then put it into a computer. But at some point, you're still going to need a computer. So when it comes to gear, besides the microphone and besides the headphones, get a computer. And also, you want to make sure that you can have quality recording software so that you can do those. And obviously, you want mic stands, you want microphone cables, you want all of that kind of stuff. All of the cables that's needed and everything else, stands, etc. Next, let's move into recording. When it comes to recording your podcast, as I just said, you can buy a standalone device that has an SD card in it. Some people record on their phone and then transfer it to the computer. Some people just record straight into the computer. But the point is that no matter what you do, it's going to land in the computer eventually. So, if you don't have a computer, be prepared to make that investment. A podcast is a part of your business, or it is you starting a business. So you're going to need a computer. You're going to need to record your podcast. There's different kind of recording softwares out there. I mean, man, there's so many. If you're on Mac, there's free things like GarageBand. If you're on like Windows PC, there's free things for that you can research. A lot of people like recording and editing podcasts in Adobe Audition. There's all kind of softwares that you can use. But when it comes to like the podcast industry and broadcast industry, a lot of people are using Adobe Audition. But you have other professional softwares like Pro Tools, Studio One, Cubase, Ableton Live, Reaper, Mixcraft, Audacity, Logic Pro, any professional recording software, aka a DAW. A DAW stands for a digital audio workstation. Any one of those is going to be capable of recording your software, so that you can do that. So once again, you either can record standalone with some kind of recording device that has an SD card built into it. You can record into your phone. There's different options for that. Or you can record straight into the computer. But no matter how you record, at the end of the pipeline, it's going to end up in a computer some kind of way. So I would say that it's easier just to record into a computer and use a computer a part of your recording process from the start, just because it's going to be the easiest. All right. Next, let's get into editing and post-production, right? So after you got your podcast recorded, you bought your gear, you're figuring out how to work it, you chosen your recording software. Now it's time to get into editing and the post-production. And when I say post-production, I'm talking about editing the podcast, mixing the podcast, mastering the podcast. And we'll have other episodes that go into this stuff on deeper levels later. This is just kind of, scratching the surface of podcast creation. You don't want to really do too much, right? So those softwares that I just named, like Adobe Audition, like Pro Tools, like Studio One, like Logic Pro, like Cubase, etc. Whatever digital audio workstation, aka DAW, you use. When you edit your podcast, you're going to be, let's say, unwanted breaths. You may do noise reduction. You may have some, static or some kind of noise in the podcast. Being able to clean it up using equalizers and compressors, limiters for final volume, things that audio engineers use. This is where you're going to do that in the editing and post-production of the podcast, getting it to an industry loudness, standard of other podcasts. This is where you're going to do all of that other stuff, okay? So choose a software, use resources like YouTube. You can contact companies like our company, Frequency Canvas, contact myself. We offer services where we teach people how to work these things. Even if you don't live in our area, we can hop on things remotely and teach you. So just choose something, learn it, don't do too much. But also you need to do things like metadata ID3 tagging for the MP3s. You want to make sure that you have the right formats that you're uploading. And you're editing, you may have intro music. So this is where your, intro or outro music. You may have sponsors or people paying for advertisement. So in the editing process, this is where you're going to get all of that stuff done and cleaned up and get ready to have those final masters presented to the world. And then after you do that, there you have to find a podcast host, right? AKA podcast distribution. A podcast host, similar to how recording artists put their music on like Apple Music, Spotify, Amazon Music. They go through a middleman, what's called a digital distributor, to get the music out on all platforms. Well, in the podcast world and in the podcast industry, these are called podcast hosts. And you have podcast hosts like Buzzsprout. You have podcast hosts like Anchor. You have podcast hosts like Podbean. And what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to upload your podcast, title it, do what's called script writing, where you do each podcast has its own, mini biography, its own description, liner notes and things like that. You might do footer notes at the bottom of that, and then you upload it, and they are going to distribute your podcast to what is called directories, and your directories is going to be those platforms like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, etc. Right? That is called a directory. Also, with a podcast host, you're going to be able to get metrics. You're going to be able to know how many downloads you're getting. You're going to be able to know just all of the metrics that you need to know about how your podcast is doing. And that's important for the growth and creation of your podcast. So I would recommend Buzzsprout. Yes, you got to pay for it, but what they're going to give you is so amazing, and it's so reliable. You want to work with a podcast host that is reliable. And I just think that Buzzsprout is probably the biggest and the most reliable in the podcast industry. So hopefully that gave y'all a little bit of game on starting up a podcast. Next episode that we do, we'll get into different price ranges and things like that. But buying podcast gear, you can buy microphones from as low as $50 to $100. If you already got a computer and get some free software, you can get a $50 to $100 USB microphone with free software and an already existing laptop or computer and be good to go. Or you can spend thousands of dollars on podcast gear and have the ultimate setup. It just really depends on your budget and what you're trying to do and what your needs are. You know what I'm saying? So hand clap for podcast creation and podcast production. Shout out to every podcaster out there, man. We get nerdy on this podcast. And just how we always do, we brought in the show with some dope music. So we're going to take out the show with some dope music. This is one of my latest singles called Like This. Let's play that.
Exceptional. Exceptional. Cairo. Engage. Fights, they ain't gon' grind like this. They ain't gon' push like this. They ain't gon' fight like this. They ain't gon' move like this. They ain't gon' build like this. They ain't gon' think like this.
Yes, sir.
They ain't gon' fight like this. They ain't gon' push like this. They ain't gon' shine like this. They ain't gon' drip like this. They ain't gon' push like this. They ain't gon' move like this. They ain't gon' fight like this.
They ain't gon' fight like this.
They ain't gon' fight like this. They ain't gon' fight like this.
Y'all be blessed, man. Board Talk Season 2, Episode 2, talking about podcast startup. Make sure that y'all check us out on all platforms, and we would greatly appreciate that, man, all right? Like, share, subscribe, comment. Email us, office@frequencycanvas.com. If y'all got some content that y'all want us to talk about on the Board Talk podcast, let us know. We would greatly appreciate it. All right, man. Y'all be blessed.